No one expected a biker to ride into Canyon Ridge that day, let alone kick a Mustang just for fun. He thought no one saw. He thought it didn't matter, that the owner was watching. And what followed wasn't revenge, it was a reckoning. Because when you hurt what can't speak, someone must speak for it. And when that someone is a man who believes in second chances, even the cruelest heart might learn to heal. Before we begin, tell us where you are watching from. And if this story touches your heart, please subscribe for more. The sun hung low over Canyon Ridge, Colorado, bathing the rugged hills in amber light as it slipped behind the snow-capped edges of the San Juan Mountains. It was late autumn, and though the air was crisp, the last warmth of the day still clung to the earth like a whispered promise. Wind stirred the tall grasses, rustling them gently around the fences of Heartstone Ranch, where horses grazed beneath cottonwoods tinged gold by the season's hand. It was the kind of afternoon where time slowed, where silence had weight, and where nothing was expected. Until the thunder of a motorcycle engine cracked through the stillness like a lightning bolt across glass. The sound tore through the valley, rude and ragged. Birds exploded from the trees. A Harley-Davidson, worn and rumbling like it had survived 1,000 bar fights, burst through the front gate uninvited. At its helm sat a man dressed in black leather, the kind of man who seemed carved from asphalt and smoke. His name was Jet Maddox. Jet was lean and sharp-faced, with sun-hardened skin and a permanent curl to his lip that hinted at mockery, even in silence. His beard was patchy, unkempt, and his jet-black hair stuck out from beneath a skull-patterned bandana. He wore mirrored aviators that hid the glint in his eyes, but his posture screamed arrogance. A drifter by reputation, he had no real ties, no real conscience, and a long list of bars and fights trailing behind him like dust. Townsfolk whispered of him as a storm with no rain, loud, useless, and often dangerous. He pulled up to the wooden rail fencing that bordered the southern pasture. There, standing in the fading sunlight like a figure out of a dream, was Onyx, a striking black Mustang stallion. Tall, proud, and wild-eyed, Onyx's coat shimmered with an oily sheen, unmarred except for the faint ghost of old scars beneath his fur. He was broad-shouldered, with powerful legs and a gaze that knew pain, and had chosen not to trust again. He had been rescued from the high desert 3 years earlier, found wandering skeletal and wounded, and it was the man who now leaned against the barn's fencing who had brought him back from the brink. Silas Greer, owner of Heartstone Ranch, was a man in his late 40s, broad-chested, with silver streaks in his dark brown hair and a beard that seemed more noble than rugged. His face, deeply lined from both sun and loss, spoke of a hard-lived past, but his pale blue eyes held a quiet, unbreakable strength. A former rodeo champion who had once dazzled crowds from Texas to Wyoming, Silas had vanished from the limelight after a fall left his best friend paralyzed, and guilt ate at him like rust. He'd found healing not in applause, but in silence, in tending broken things, starting with himself. Onyx was his mirror. From his post near the barn, Silas watched the biker with growing stillness. The horses grazing nearby snorted uneasily, hooves shifting against the dust as if sensing a tremor. Jet dismounted, boots hitting the ground with a thud. He approached the fence and stood just a few feet from Onyx, who lifted his head and stared, nostrils flaring, uncertain. "Pretty horse," Jet said aloud, not to anyone in particular. "Too clean." Then, as if boredom bit him, Jet reared back and delivered a savage kick to Onyx's side, just under the ribs. The sound of boot against flesh echoed in the canyon like a whip crack. The horse reared, snorting and stumbling backward, his eyes wide with pain and betrayal. The other horses bolted, their hooves tearing the ground, sending clumps of dirt flying into the autumn air. Jet laughed, loud and hollow. It was the laugh of someone who mistook dominance for power and cruelty for control. He didn't look back as he mounted his bike and gunned the engine. He peeled out of the ranch in a trail of exhaust and dust, oblivious to the shadows standing just beyond the paddock. Silas hadn't moved. Not yet. But his fists were clenched, white around the rail. His heart hammered with fury, but his face remained calm, unreadable, the way mountains look before they break. He stepped forward and whistled sharply, a sound only Onyx would respond to. The stallion limped toward him, eyes still wild but searching. Silas placed a steady hand on the creature's neck, feeling the tremble beneath skin and sinew. He said nothing, just leaned his forehead gently against Onyx's, letting the warmth and breath of the animal calm him. And then, as dusk settled over the hills, Silas's mind wandered, back to the first time he'd seen this horse. It was a scorched afternoon 3 years ago in a sun-beaten stretch of Utah desert. Silas had been out checking a water line when he spotted something in the distance, a black shape dragging itself across the sand. At first, he thought it was a mirage, but as he got closer, he saw the raw wounds on its flanks, the cracked hooves, the ribs pushing through skin like broken piano keys. The Mustang had collapsed beside a dry bush, unable to stand. No one knew where it had come from, perhaps an illegal roundup gone wrong, or simply abandoned by a handler who lost patience. Silas had called for help, but no one came, so he made a sling from his saddle blanket, hoisted the horse's body inch by inch into his trailer, and drove home in silence. It took months to rebuild trust. Onyx didn't accept carrots or touch. He flinched from voices. But slowly, carefully, with sunrise feedings and whispered patience, Silas had earned something rarer than obedience. He'd earned presence, a connection. And now, in one ignorant instant, a stranger had tried to shatter that. Callie Boone would need to see this. She was the ranch's right hand, smart, sharp, and fiercely protective of the animals under her care. But she wasn't here yet. For now, it was just Silas and Onyx, both standing still as twilight crept in, watching the road where Jet had disappeared. Silas whispered under his breath, voice low and certain, "He'll come back, and he'll learn something when he does." The wind picked up again, rustling the dry weeds, carrying with it the scent of leather, blood, and unfinished justice. Somewhere in the hills, a hawk cried out, shrill and lonely. And beneath that sky of molten lavender, a storm was quietly forming, not in clouds, but in conviction. Dawn arrived reluctantly over Canyon Ridge, painting the sky in bruised violets and pale gold. A thin frost had settled overnight, glazing fence posts and barn eaves with a shimmer that sparkled in the first light. The wind had stilled, but the air remained sharp, biting like a whispered warning. Heartstone Ranch, with its rolling pastures and aging timber barns, stood silent, except for the restless shifting of hooves and the low, uneasy snort of a black stallion in the main paddock. Onyx hadn't eaten. He stood with his weight shifted to the opposite side, his flank still bruised from the biker's kick, and his eyes tracked movement like a soldier waiting for attack. His proud posture remained, but something in him had tightened, like a violin string pulled too far. Silas Greer stepped into the barn with a thermos in one hand and a worn flannel slung over his shoulder. He had slept in the tack room again, unwilling to leave Onyx unattended. He leaned on the stall gate, watching the Mustang for a long moment. "We'll get him," he murmured. But not with fists, with something louder. Behind him, the crunch of gravel under boots broke the silence. "Didn't expect a sunrise call," a woman said, her voice low but brisk. "But then again, I saw the smoke signals last night. What happened?" Callie Boone stood in the open barn doorway, framed by light and morning chill. Tall and reed slim, she had the posture of someone always prepared to sprint, either toward trouble or away from it, depending on the need. Her auburn hair was braided down one shoulder, half tucked into a battered denim jacket. She wore no makeup, just sun and wind on her freckled face. At 32, Callie had already lived 2 lives, one in city clinics treating dogs with broken hips and cats with cancer, and the other in the mountains, coaxing wolves out of traps and rescuing half-frozen foals during winter storms. She was tough, competent, and fiercely loyal. A single betrayal, her former mentor euthanizing a healthy, aggressive dog for convenience, had driven her out of urban veterinary care for good. Since then, she'd found purpose in Heartstone Ranch, where Silas had offered her a cabin, a job, and something rarer than both, trust. Silas handed her the thermos. "Coffee still warm?" "Onyx was assaulted yesterday by a man on a Harley. I saw it. Didn't stop it in time." Callie's expression sharpened. "What kind of man kicks a horse?" She walked over to Onyx, speaking to him softly as she approached. The stallion didn't flinch but kept his ears turned toward her. "Easy, boy," she said, opening her pack. She pulled out a tin of crushed herbs, arnica, lavender, and comfrey, and began mixing it with warm water. She worked in silence for a while, brushing the salve gently into Onyx's fur. "Who was it?" she asked finally. "Jet Maddox," Silas said, voice like gravel. Came through here like he owned the place, didn't recognize him until he was gone. Callie stood brushing her hands clean. Jet Maddox. That name's been floating around town. He's part of a drifting motorcycle group, calls themselves the Dust Wives. Ride in, raise hell, disappear. Silas nodded. I thought I saw a sticker on his gas tank. Skull with a raven on top. Yeah, Callie said grimly. That's them. Silas crossed his arms. I don't want the law involved yet. I've seen how that goes. Charges vanish. He rides out before the ink dries. But if I confront him right, face to face, with truth in hand, maybe it lands harder than a warrant ever could. Callie gave him a sideways glance. You're betting on a conscience? I'm betting on exposure, Silas said. People can't walk away from what everyone else sees. Before she could respond, the door to the barn creaked again, and a new voice entered, gruff, breathless. Silas, we've got something. Rowan Dade, the ranch's farrier and general handyman, stepped inside. A wiry man in his late 50s with forearms like tree branches and a beard that reached halfway down his chest, Rowan had been with the ranch since its founding. He was missing 2 fingers on his left hand, bitten off by a wild mule in his youth, and spoke in a voice that sounded permanently wind-chapped. He handed Silas a photograph, printed, grainy, and clearly taken from a security camera. Town diner. Maddox parked his bike out front yesterday. I got a shot of the plate and the sticker. There's your proof. Silas held the photo to the light. The plate was clear. So was the raven skull sticker. We've got our lead, Silas said. He drinks at Rusted Spur, right? Rowan nodded. Friday nights, sometimes Thursdays. Doesn't tip. Bites fast. Callie added, I can get my friend Mia to push the story. She writes for the Canyon Ridge Bulletin. People listen to her. Silas considered. Let's do it. We hit every front. Quiet, loud, public, and personal. Later that day, Callie sat at her desk in the ranch's office trailer, typing out a detailed account of the attack and Onyx's condition. She attached a before and after photo, Onyx in full gallop across the field, and now, eyes wary, muscles tense. She emailed it to Mia Keller, a local journalist known for writing about small-town injustice with a voice that could turn embers into wildfire. Mia was a petite woman in her 40s, with round glasses and ink-stained fingers. A former reporter for Denver Post turned small-town columnist, she had traded city chaos for clarity, and she never backed down from a story with teeth. Her column, Canyon Truths, had once led to the removal of a corrupt sheriff. By nightfall, the article was scheduled to go live. Its title? Silence is not consent. Mustang assaulted on private ranch, owner speaks out. The town would wake to it tomorrow. So would Jet Maddox. And he wouldn't be able to run from that kind of mirror. Night came to Canyon Ridge like a slow-falling curtain, turning the sky from gold to iron. The stars blinked into place one by one, quiet witnesses to everything men chose to do under cover of darkness. Out on the edge of town, past the rail yard and the truck depot, sat a building that looked like it had survived 5 fires and 3 brawls, because it had. The Rusted Spur Saloon leaned crookedly against the cold, its sign flickering like an old wound that wouldn't close. Inside, the air was thick with beer, sweat, and music that had long since stopped being about melody and started being about volume. Silas Greer parked his old Chevy a few blocks away and walked the rest of the distance alone, boots crunching through loose gravel. He wore his oldest coat, a thick canvas duster faded by sun and time, and a black Stetson pulled low over his brow. He hadn't stepped into a place like this in over a decade, not since the accident, not since the rodeo circuit had spit him out and left him with more scars than stories. But tonight wasn't about memory. It was about confrontation and justice. Inside, the bar pulsed with laughter and chaos. Neon signs glowed over dusty wood, and the crowd swayed like a single breathing animal. Silas moved through them like a boulder through a stream, steady and silent, until he reached the back booth beneath the rusted spur nailed to the wall. There sat Jet Maddox, sprawled in a leather jacket that squeaked when he laughed, surrounded by half a dozen bikers, mostly men with rough hands and road-weary eyes. One woman sat beside him, dark-haired and sharp-jawed, wearing heavy eyeliner and a smirk that never quite reached her eyes. That was Renee Knox, Jet's on-again, off-again companion, known around the local racing circuit for her speed and her spite. She had a lean build, calloused fingers, and a streak of gray in her ponytail despite being no older than 35. A car crash in her 20s had given her a permanent limp and a permanent chip on her shoulder. Silas stopped 2 steps from the table. Jet Maddox. The table fell quiet, except for the clink of a beer bottle. Jet leaned back, unimpressed. "Well, hell, if it ain't the rancher. Come for a drink, cowboy?" "I came for answers," Silas said, voice even. "You kicked my horse." Jet shrugged, exaggerating the motion like it meant nothing. "Just a horse." A pause. Then Silas took a slow step forward. "Not just to me. Not anymore to this town. You think because an animal can't speak it doesn't matter? That its pain is invisible?" Renee arched an eyebrow. "You gonna give us a sermon, preacher?" Silas's eyes never left Jet. "No. Just a warning. What you did, it's out there now. Video, photos, the whole story. I didn't need to throw a punch, Jet. I just needed to tell the truth." Jet's smirk faltered. A flicker of something, doubt, maybe, passed behind his eyes. Silas continued. "Tomorrow morning, the sheriff's gonna want a word. So's the paper. So's anyone with a conscience and a horse in their care. You can laugh now, but this won't follow you for a day. It'll follow you like a shadow." Renee scoffed, crossing her arms. "You seriously gonna get the law involved over a kick?" "I'm not getting the law involved," Silas said. "The law is getting involved on its own, and if you want to walk out of this with your name intact, Jet, you'd better start thinking like a man instead of a weapon." For a long moment, no one spoke. Then Jet stood. Slowly. He was taller than Silas by half a head, but he didn't carry the same weight in his stance. He gestured toward the door with a lazy hand. "Get out of here, old man. Take your damn horse-loving sermon somewhere else." Silas didn't move. "Last chance. Own what you did, or let it own you." Then, without waiting for a response, he turned and walked back through the crowd. A few bikers parted wordlessly. Some glanced at Jet with something less than respect. The air had shifted, and Jet knew it. The next morning broke cold and loud. Canyon Truths, the local bulletin, published Mia Keller's story just after dawn. By 8 a.m., it had already been shared nearly 1,000 times online. The security footage Rowan had pulled from the ranch, slightly grainy but unmistakable, showed Jet's boot connecting with Onyx's side. The still frame was brutal, undeniable. The piece quoted Silas's account, included a brief history of Onyx's rescue, and featured comments from Callie Boone about trauma in animals and how trust was not just earned, but fragile. Social media lit up with comments, outrage, and demands for accountability. Several local riders, part of the Canyon Ridge Equestrian Co-op, publicly condemned the act. Even the regional sheriff's office shared the article on their page with a note. "We are reviewing the incident and will speak with all parties involved." Sheriff Grady Nichols, a barrel-chested man with a snow-white mustache and a reputation for balancing grit with grace, paid Silas a visit before lunch. He arrived in his usual truck, boots caked in red dirt and his hat tucked under one arm. "Saw the footage," he said. "We're not looking at jail time, but public nuisance, property trespass, and animal cruelty, that adds up." Grady had been sheriff for almost 20 years. A former Army Ranger, he brought with him a strong sense of order and a personal code that went deeper than the letter of the law. He'd grown up with horses, and his expression had darkened when he saw the video. "I'm bringing him in for questioning," he added. "But between you and me, this kid's been headed for something like this for a long time. Maybe now's the time he gets his reckoning." That evening, Callie returned from town with 2 items. The first was a bag of new feed for Onyx. The second was a manila envelope. "Mia sent it," she said, handing it to Silas. Inside were printed messages, letters actually, from people across the state. Some were from ranchers, some from kids. One note, written in pink crayon, read, "I love your horse. Please give him an apple from me." Silas folded the letter slowly. Then he walked outside to the fence line, where Onyx stood beneath the cottonwoods, head lowered against the wind. He took a gala apple from the bag and held it out. Onyx stepped forward, slow and deliberate, and took it gently from his hand. The crowd had spoken. Now it was time to see if the man responsible could hear it. The sky over Canyon Ridge hung gray and heavy, the first signs of an approaching winter gathering quietly on the horizon. The wind carried the sharp scent of snow, still hours away but inevitable. At Heartstone Ranch, the pastures lay still beneath the overcast light. The horses moving slowly in their routines, unaware, or perhaps unconcerned, that justice had taken a strange new form. Jet Maddox stood outside the barn, his arms crossed tightly across his chest, his breath fogging in the morning air. Gone was the biker arrogance of the rusted spur. In its place stood a man stripped of excuses, guarded and uncertain. He wore a borrowed work jacket 2 sizes too big, the word Rowan still stitched above the breast pocket. His jeans, once clean and jet black, were now streaked with dirt and hay. Sheriff Grady Nichols had delivered him to Heartstone Ranch at dawn, not in cuffs, but under an agreement brokered quietly between Silas and the county, community restitution in exchange for dropped charges. For the next 30 days, Jet would work the ranch, and he would face the very animal he'd hurt. Silas watched from the barn doors, arms resting on the ledge. "You're free to leave anytime," he said, "but if you walk, you'll walk into a courtroom next. Your choice." Jet said nothing, jaw tight, but he didn't move. Inside the barn, Callie Boone waited with a clipboard and a bucket of feed. She hadn't spoken more than 5 words to Jet since his arrival, and none of them had been kind. Today, she handed him a broom without looking at him. "Stall 2 and 3. Muck, rake, lime, don't skip the corners." Jet stared at her. "You're not even going to pretend to say good morning?" Callie finally met his eyes. "You haven't earned that yet." The work was hard. Silas didn't ease him into it. Jet found himself hauling hay bales heavier than some motorcycles, wrestling a rusted gate hinge with a busted wrench, and shoveling piles of manure that steamed in the cold. His back ached, his boots blistered, his pride burned. But something else smoldered too. Something quieter. It happened on the 3rd day. Jet was working the western paddock fence when Silas approached, a saddlebag slung over his shoulder. He tossed Jet a bottle of water and leaned against the post. "You ever wonder what brought that horse to you?" Jet wiped his face with his sleeve. "Bad luck?" "No," Silas said, his voice even. "It's a loop. Pain passed from hand to hoof, hoof to heart. You didn't start it, but you stepped into it, and now, maybe, you can end it." Jet snorted. "You sound like some rancher Buddha." Silas didn't smile. "When I found Onyx, he was dying under a mesquite bush in Utah. Coyotes had already circled. He was skin over bones, no water, no hope. I don't know why he didn't lie down and quit. Maybe something inside him still wanted to believe." Jet said nothing. Silas let the silence settle like dust. Later that afternoon, Callie brought out a grooming kit. She placed it beside Jet without a word. "Brush him," she said. Jet blinked. "You serious?" She pointed toward the stall. Onyx stood within, head high, eyes alert. "See if he lets you." There was no crowd, no speeches, just Jet and the horse. He stepped into the stall slowly. His hands trembled slightly, whether from cold or nerves, he couldn't tell. He raised the brush. Onyx didn't move. Jet brought the brush down gently, beginning at the shoulder, working in long, slow strokes. The stallion remained still, ears flicking slightly, but his body relaxed inch by inch. His eyes locked onto Jet's, not in fear, but in recognition. It was the first time since the kick that the Mustang had allowed him near. Callie watched from a distance, arms crossed. Her expression was unreadable, but her stance had softened. As the days turned to a week, the rhythm of the ranch began to reshape Jet. He rose before the sun, shoveled before breakfast, and learned how to patch a waterline before lunch. Rowan Dade, ever the gruff teacher, taught him how to fit a bridle without pinching the horse's jaw and how to gauge hoof rot by smell alone. The old man rarely praised, but once muttered, "Not bad," after Jet fixed a lopsided gate hinge. One night in the quiet of the tack room, Jet sat on an overturned bucket and listened to the wind howl outside. Silas joined him, carrying 2 mugs of black coffee. He handed one to Jet and said nothing for a long time. Then Silas pulled a photo from his coat pocket. It was a faded image, himself in his rodeo prime, wearing a bright red shirt and gripping the rope of a bucking bronco midair. "That was the last ride?" he said quietly. "Horse reared too soon. My best friend was in the chute beside me. He got tangled, broke his spine, never walked again. I walked off the circuit the next day, never picked up a rope again." Jet looked down at the photo. "That's why you started this place?" "No," Silas said. "I started this place because I needed somewhere to bleed where no one would see it. But Onyx, he gave me a reason to heal." There was no grand breakthrough, no tears or apologies. But that night, Jet didn't sleep in the bunkhouse. He slept in the hayloft above Onyx's stall. By the end of the 2nd week, Callie handed him a real task. supervising the colts during feed time. One of them, a copper-colored filly named Maple, had been born with one eye. Skittish and often bullied by the other colts, she had a tendency to shy away from sudden movement. But to Jet's surprise, she approached him without fear. He knelt beside her, holding out a handful of oats. She pressed her velvet nose into his palm. "She likes you," Callie said from the fence, faint amusement in her voice. "She's the only one," Jet muttered. Callie tilted her head. Maybe she sees something the rest of us don't. Or maybe she knows what it's like to be treated like less and still trust anyway. That night, Jet wrote something in a pocket notebook. No one saw what it was, but Silas noticed the pen stains on his fingers. Snow came quietly to Canyon Ridge that morning, brushing the pastures in white and wrapping the fences in soft silence. The sky was pale and blank, like the first page of a new story waiting to be written. At Heartstone Ranch, the animals stirred slowly in their stalls, the breath of each horse rising in little clouds of warmth against the cold. It had been 30 days since Jet Maddox first stepped foot on the ranch as punishment. Today, he stepped out as something else. The transformation hadn't been loud or showy. It wasn't marked by any single moment, but stitched together by 1,000 quiet ones. Feeding a nervous colt, repairing a frost-snapped pipe, brushing Onyx each evening while whispering apologies not always in words. His hair had grown out slightly, and he had started tying it back with an old leather string. He'd trimmed his beard and no longer wore the bandana or the black aviators. His jeans were still frayed, but now worn from work, not pretense. He had become, in Callie Boone's words, a man that dirt recognizes. Inside the main barn, a long wooden table had been cleared of tools and saddles and covered in mismatched tablecloths. There were mason jars of spiced cider, loaves of cornbread, and steaming pans of Callie's famous 3-bean chili. It wasn't much, but for ranch folk, it was a celebration. Rowan Dade, the old farrier, had even brought his battered harmonica and sat by the hay bales, playing slow, wheezy songs that somehow made the warmth of the barn even deeper. Callie stood near the tackroom door, arms folded, a rare smile playing on her lips. She wore a flannel shirt under her vest and had braided her hair tightly today. Part ceremony, part control. Despite her usual toughness, her eyes softened when they found Jet across the room. Jet was helping a young girl pour cider into cups. Lila Briggs, just 11 years old, had been coming to the ranch every weekend since summer. Petite, with thick-rimmed glasses and long curls, always tied in lopsided ponytails, she was a quiet girl who rarely spoke unless it was to animals. She had a mild speech delay, something doctors called selective mutism. But here at Heartstone, she spoke fluently, to horses, to dogs, and lately to Jet. He had taken to her instantly, treating her like a person, not a diagnosis. Today, she handed him a hand-drawn card of a black horse standing next to a stick figure man with wild hair. The word "friend" was scrawled beneath in crayon. Jet blinked fast and tucked the card into his jacket pocket. Silas stood from his seat at the head of the table. He didn't clink a glass or raise a toast. That wasn't his way. But he spoke with the same calm gravity he always carried. "Most of you know why we're here," he began. "A month ago, I thought I'd watched a man commit an unforgivable act. But forgiveness is a funny thing. It doesn't come easy, and it sure as hell doesn't come quick. It's earned, quietly, day by day." He glanced at Onyx, who stood in the nearest stall, his head leaning over the gate as if listening. Onyx isn't just a horse. He's what happens when you don't give up. When someone sees past scars and decides healing is still worth the work, and so's this man. He turned to Jet, who stood, frozen for a breath, hands shoved deep in his coat. "I don't know what road you'll take next," Silas said. "But I know you're not the man who walked through my gates. You're not a biker or a drifter or a name in a sheriff's file. You're a man who worked, who tried, and who changed. And for that, you'll always have a place at Heartstone. If not in job, then in memory." There was a pause, then a soft round of applause. Rowan's harmonica gave a low hum in the background. Even Mia Keller, who had stopped by briefly with her notepad and camera, wiped a corner of her eye discreetly. After the food had been picked clean and the cider was gone, Jet wandered back to Onyx's stall. The Mustang stood tall, dark mane slightly tangled, his coat gleaming under the lantern light. Jet reached out, resting a hand gently on the horse's neck. "You remember who I was," he murmured, "but I hope you know I'm not him anymore." Onyx lowered his head and nudged Jet's shoulder softly, one solid, deliberate push, a gesture of trust, of something that almost felt like forgiveness. Behind him, Callie approached with something in her hand. It was small and wrapped in brown paper. She handed it over without fanfare. "Just a little something," she said. Jet unwrapped it slowly. Inside was a weathered iron horseshoe, polished clean and engraved along the curve with 4 simple words. "For the road ahead, be kind." Jet swallowed. "Did you make this?" "Had it done," she said, "by a friend. Thought you might need it more than a patch or a map." He nodded, holding the charm like it weighed more than iron. An hour later, the snow thickened, and Jet packed up his things into the saddlebag of a modest motorcycle. Now gray instead of black, the raven skull sticker long scraped off. Silas, Callie, Rowan, and Lila stood by the gate as he turned to look at them one last time. "I don't know where I'm headed yet," he said, "but I know what I'm leaving behind, and that's more than I ever thought I'd have." Lila tugged at his sleeve and handed him a second drawing, this one of a horseshoe with wings. She whispered, just loud enough for him to hear, "For luck." Jet gave her a crooked smile. "I'll take all I can get." And then he was gone, not with the roar of rebellion, but with the steady hum of purpose, riding into snowfall that made the whole world look like it had been reborn. This story reminds us that change doesn't come through anger or punishment, but through honesty, work, and the courage to face what we've broken. Whether it's a horse, a person, or a part of ourselves, healing begins when we choose compassion over pride. In our daily lives, we often pass by those who've made mistakes, some small, some heavy. But what if we believed they could change? What if we offered a path instead of a wall? If this story moved you, take a moment to reflect on your own second chances, or the ones you've given. Then help us spread that message. Share this video, leave a comment, and subscribe to the channel. Your voice might be the start of someone else's redemption.